All right, Shamans, this one's for you because Blizzard has detailed some massive Shaman changes coming to the War Within with a new Sky Fury raid buff. Not only that, but the class also got a decent amount of just, general changes where I read that there was actually a lot of pretty positive Restoration Shaman stuff. They tried to condense the availability of damage-focused nodes in the spec tree to free up more points to, put points into healing, with things such as Ascendance and Tidebringer being more available in locations. It seemed like Jack and Thune were pretty positive, just in general, about the thought process on Restoration Shaman. With the two most notable spells being Healing Surge and Spirit Link Totem. Funnily enough, I actually think that the coolest totem is probably Cloudburst, and I think that Restoration Shaman's utilization of Cloudburst is a banger, and so more utilization of that ability is sick. On top of that, I don't know how Ellie feels to play. I haven't talked to any Elemental Shamans, but I know apparently it's overtuned on the beta, which I suspect will not last long because Shamans can't have anything that's nice. And then Ward Up seemed like he was in grave despair talking about Enhancement Shaman, where he basically stated, in closing, this felt like a missed opportunity to do a very simple fix to a serious problem. There was even more room to do really cool stuff and fix a lot of dead talent / underlying problems that have been there throughout Dragonflight. But they just kind of ignored that. I would have been more happy with just the point adjustments. But the situation we're staring down is that those issues we've ignored are now more pervasive than they and no longer can be pervasive, alongside some of the extra new ones that we'll have to deal with as well. Situation is fundamentally worse in structure by the addition of hero talents. Ooh. And with very small amount of tweaks, most of this could have been avoided. Ultimately, I'm not mad about the lack of action. I'm just disappointed that something so small with such high impact wasn't done. And I think that a lot of classes are actually running into this issue where their hero talents are pretty negatively affecting pathing choices and negatively affecting just in general how you're going to be playing your specialization, to the point where players are not super thrilled. I know that whenever hero talents were first starting to be announced, there were very few hero talents that people were excited to play with. I think that they've gotten to a point where some hero talent suites are kind of cool, but they still haven't kind of fully fixed the issue where hero talents just aren't really that sick. Anyhow, unfortunate for the Shamans. Hopefully Blizzard will continue to do more changes to them. It seems like that data mining today is not revealing more than a small fraction of the package of changes that will be coming in the next beta build. We'll fully outline it for you here as soon as possible. Hopefully they continue to get more feedback. I think that Shaman was left kind of in the dust with actually out any changes all of the beta and alpha cycle up until this point, which is problematic. And I think that players are really, of course, panicking because whenever Blizzard designs classes and design specializations, they design them at an expansion level. And if you don't get any massive changes on an expansion level, very rarely do you get anything in the middle of an expansion. Dragonflight kind of changed the mold a little bit with that, with some of the larger reworks that happen in the middle of the expansion. But more often than not, if you want something large to happen with your spec or your class, it's probably going to have to start from the ground up at the very beginning of the expansion. Additionally, if your spec or your class kind of sucks and it feels bad to play, having to play that for multiple patches until they can rework you in the middle of an expansion also sucks. And so I've seen a lot of people commenting being like, Blizzard should actually just do more regular tuning. Blizzard should actually do more regular class changes to try to improve the quality of life of classes, as opposed to, once the patch is shipped, all right, we're taking a break, we'll be back next patch. Like that, I feel like people have kind of been less accepting of that as time has gone on. All right, Sky Fury. Let's talk about Sky Fury Totem. So raid buffs have been a hot topic for a while. Sky Fury Totem, now this is going to be the replacement version of Wind Fury Totem. Through the middle of Shadowlands to now, Enhancement Shaman had largely a spot in the melee composition where you would bring 4 other melee DPS, you would drop a Wind Fury Totem, they would do more damage or generate more resources with their auto attacks due to Wind Fury Totem. And that kind of allowed Enhancement Shaman to have a spot in a raid that we hadn't seen for a very long time, and that was cool. Blizzard has decided that now Wind Fury Totem is going to be deleted and Sky Fury Totem is going to be added, where our goal for this buff is to fully replace Wind Fury Totem buff previously brought by an Enhancement Shaman and grant Elemental and Restoration access to a raid buff to encourage their value in raids. This is good. I think that you had no basic need or reason to bring an Enhancement or Restoration Shaman. Oh, I said Enhancement. Elemental or Restoration Shaman outside of them just being really well tuned. they haven't been not even insanely tuned, and so you didn't see them for a while, which I think is unfortunate because if you're a Resto Shaman lover, you got to sit on the bench for a hot minute. Players may also note that this is lifting the party-wide restriction previously placed on Wind Fury Totem's effect and turning it into a guaranteed raid-wide effect. Basically, what it's going to do is it's going to increase melee damage, and on top of that, give you a little bit of mastery. So this is a raid buff that is not just for melee DPS anymore. Now it is for all players basically inside the raid, which is good. But I think with that being the case, Blizzard then started looking at Retribution Aura and was like, all right, Red Aura, you got to go. So Red Aura, first and foremost, was pretty buggy. It didn't proc consistently on damage taken like it was supposed to. Whenever any party or raid member within 40 yards takes more than 30% of their health in damage in a single hit, each member gains 5% increased damage and healing, decaying over 30 seconds. This did not proc consistently like it was supposed to. Some classes, I want to say it was like Prot Paladin, didn't proc it effectively at all, where other specs like Ret Paladin procced it pretty consistently. And so that created a weird dynamic where you weren't getting all the value out of Red Aura that you were supposed to. On top of that, for some reason, Paladins just had 2 raid buffs while some classes didn't have any. And that created a lot of class envy. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to kind of talk about raid buffs for a little bit and just kind of talk about the importance of raid buffs. So first and foremost, I see a lot of people kind of asking why raid buffs are important. I think let's take this mage here. That I just pulled up this random fire rack log. This isn't any specific log. I just wanted something to kind of talk over it. That way you guys can kind of see the point illustrated. So whenever you take this mage here, the arcane intellect that he's giving to himself gives him about 15,000-ish DPS, give or take a little bit. But the AI, it's not like the end of the world. And if it was just for him, that 15,000 DPS, in the grand scheme of the entire raid, if you look at this, they're doing 5.6 million DPS, is not that much. However, whenever you factor in how much damage it's providing for the rest of the raid, it's actually providing 142,000 DPS for the rest of the raid, which whenever you add that 142,000 DPS on top of the damage that the Fire Mage is doing, that brings them from being in last place from all the damage dealers to being even above this Devastation Evoker. It's actually like right below the Havoc Demon Hunter in terms of the damage that they're contributing. So they go all the way from, 14th place all the way into 2nd. Which is ridiculous. 142,000 DPS from a raid buff is absurd. He's doing basically half of his DPS just from the raid buff that's being provided. And so then, of course, going from 0 arcane intellects to 1 arcane intellect is basically bringing a, 20 and a half players. And that's the same case for the Feral Druid in this group. That's the same case for the BM Hunter in this group. Bringing the first copy of every single raid buff is basically bringing another half character on top of that. This also happens for the defensive auras as well for healers, where without Fortitude, that's a half healer. Without without Devo Aura, that's a half of a healer that you're going to have to bring instead. So then you would have to 5 heal something that you would otherwise be able to 4 heal in other situations if you don't have those raid buffs. And so by adding in all the raid buffs, going from 0 copy to 1 copy makes sense. Now, Blizzard has stated time and time again that the purpose of raid buffs is to create compositional diversity, and you see that. Right here, I used the Wowhead, raid comp tool to kind of talk about and add in all of the raid buffs that you see. You actually see double Augmentation Evoker, Blessing of the Bronze by itself, not specifically strong, but with how Augmentation currently buffs players with Ebb and Might and Shifting Sands and whatnot, double Aug is pretty optimal. Just in terms of how much value they're gaining from buffing players inside of a raid situation. So I put double Aug here. In theory, you don't need Aug or Evoker, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to play like you do because you probably are going to. I think that there's very few situations where you're not. So if you look at the numbers here, 13 slots are locked up. And this is really bad for Death Knight. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is really bad for Death Knight. They're the haves and the have-nots. And if you take 10 raid fights per tier, one of those might be a Death Knight raid fight. All 10 of those is a Mark of the Wild raid fight. So there's clearly a disparity with the haves and the have-nots. Them creating a raid buff for Hunter and Shaman is great, but then that creates even fewer slots for a class like a DK to see play. And so let's kind of talk about this. 13 slots are locked up, and I think that that's actually very problematic because then these in theory, 13 players are going to be locked up for the entire raid. Say something is good, right? Say Mistweaver Monk is the best healer, so that's going to be, we're going to be doubling up on Monk buff, not the end of the world. Then say Warlock is good, so we're going to double up on Warlock again, not the end of the world. And say Mage is good, so we're going to be doubling up on Mage. This creates a weird situation where, say, Vengeance is the best tank, and say Blood Decay is the best tank. And we have a Blood Brewmaster tier, which is fairly standard, I think, at this point. And then you have to bring in the Havoc Demon Hunter. Now, we have gone from, in theory, 20 raid slots that are you have the option to bring classes for, to 3 raid slots that are flexible from a per-fight basis. Because then you have all of your raid buffs, and then you have these 3 slots that are going to be flexible. Whereas the rest of these 17 players are going to be playing every single fight for the entire tier due to, mostly due to raid buffs, but, in part could be also due to their class being good. And so we have moved heavily away from we're bringing exceptional players, and now we've moved it into we're bringing raid buffs, and we're bringing the same, 17 players per tier. Blizzard also, by doing this with raid buffs, really de-incentivizes flex play and alts and being a strong multi-classer, and instead more incentivizes being a main that hyper fixates and hyper focuses on one class, not even one character, but one class, to where you're always playing that class because you're going to be able to play it every single tier, and you're always going to be bringing the raid buff, and that's what it is. I think this is really bad. I think this is really bad for a multitude of reasons. First and foremost, it's really hard to get into a raid as a second copy of any of the classes. Even if your class is kind of good, being the second copy of any raid buff class is basically, you're not playing, you're probably better off finding a new raid guild, that kind of situation. Additionally, being a Death Knight in particular is terrible, because like I said earlier, there are 10 fights out of 10 that require Mark of the Wild, where there is 1 fight out of 10 that might require grip. And so I think that Blizzard needs to either fully commit to this, and Death Knight needs a raid buff. Death Knight should be getting raid buff. Or, alternatively, they actually kind of cut back on how many raid buffs we have, and every class kind of shares them, where, Mage and Warlock would share a raid buff. Evoker and Shaman could share a raid buff. Paladin and Priest could share a raid buff. Druid and Hunter could share a raid buff. Right? And these classes will share raid buffs with other classes, and that would actually create a situation where, there's still some class diversity that is required due to the raid buffs, but it's not 13 specializations. And I think that, the 13 specialization issue is a pretty profound one, where I don't think that that's very healthy for the state of the game. It kind of creates a weird situation where in the past you would look at WoW Prog being like, we're recruiting exceptional players, but that's largely died. Now, basically, you have to recruit, my long-term Havoc Demon Hunter player in my guild retired. And so instead of recruiting exceptional players, we're now recruiting a Havoc Demon Hunter player because we have to have that raid buff because, this Havoc Demon Hunter is going from doing 482,000 DPS to 560,000 DPS whenever he Chaos Brands the boss 1 time. And so that's, very problematic. I think it's good that they removed Ret Aura. I don't think that Paladin locking up 2 slots in a raid really made a lot of sense. And it reduced the amount of flex spots that are possible. And I think that having more flex spots for players to be able to get into the raid and get involved, especially at a mythic level whenever compositions are kind of restricted, is good. Blizzard has stated time and time again that their purpose for raid buffs is to create diversity, which I think is like a noble cause, but I think that the way that they're going about it is very, very bad. Obviously, I think it's problematic. I don't know that Blizzard's necessarily going to be changing their mind. At this point, I think the best thing we can do is just give a raid buff to Death Knight, and raiding guilds are still just going to be pretty annoyed, and this raid buff situation isn't going to be solved. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. I'm actually happy for Shamans because this is going to actually create a lot more situations where more Shaman specializations are going to be able to see play, potentially seeing the rise of Healer Shaman. I didn't necessarily mention this, but I probably should have. I actually think that there's also a larger issue with raid buffs as well, where the tank and the healer roles are... Okay, so let me pause for a second. In general, you want to bring the best specialization of that class that brings the raid buff. That's kind of your goal. Unless it involves a healer or a tank, which in that case, those are your flex spots where if DPS warrior's bad, you're going to be bringing a prot warrior. If ret and prot paladin aren't great, say they're average, and holy paladin's also average, you might just bring the holy paladin. That way you can kind of load up on things that are slightly better with the 3 flex spots. And I think that that's a really bad situation where you just offload all of your raid buffs into the healer and the tank role. I think that that is a terrible way of designing this raid buff system, where most of them are just getting offloaded into the healer and the tank role. But yeah. Anyhow, I don't really have too much more else to say. That was this week's news. Hopefully we get some more interesting changes next week. Hopefully they fix the shaman situation that WordUp was talking about in this large post. And I will see you guys in next week's video. Goodbye.